Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to try to make this as brief and helpful as possible. Um, I'm getting some questions from students just about, what the interview portion of this class is. Okay, so just to kind of clarify a few things. Uh, Again, this is a course on ethnographic and autoethnographic research. That is going to make sense to some of you, and it's going to feel very confusing to others. But at the end of this class, uh, I think that the main goal of really kind of what you should be thinking about is the way in which this particular kind of research methodology, which is grounded in historically social science research, but of course has, as you already I'm sure can tell, many kind of overlapping qualities with journalism, with creative writing, and therefore with the humanities. So I would say that, because this is a composition course, it is in the composition program of our school. Mostly, that is tied to English departments, which are also tied to the School of Humanities. I think some of the confusion can, to me, it's very self-explanatory, but I think some of the confusion comes from, things as simple as like citation guides. In social sciences, you use APA style for your works cited page. In the humanities, you use MLA style. So since we are in the humanities, technically, we'll be using MLA formatting. Okay. And that does matter. It might not seem like it matters, but it does matter because the interdisciplinary center of this class is more of a humanities thing. In other words, we're using many different types of sources, many different kinds of modes of thinking. We're thinking about multiple types of discourse communities. If you're not familiar with the term discourse community, it's really, I think the best way to put it is like, a way of talking within a particular community. So it's like the best example is like in a family, right? And if a family is a discourse community. So if you're all gathered together, you tend to have certain kinds of speech patterns, modes of communication that to you all make sense. And to the outsider, might come in and be able to follow along, but sometimes feel like, they don't really quite get what's being said, because what's being said is modeled on a particularly like on a shared language, right? It's like we all might speak one language, but we also have this other kind of family language that we speak, and that is what a discourse community is really all about. So even in families, in professional situations, in institutions of any kind, even if they're like a church, these are all kind of modeled on what is, if you want to kind of study the mode of communication, you would be studying a discourse community. So what does all of this have to do with conducting an ethnographic interview? Well, first and foremost, it has to do with learning how to kind of immerse yourself in the discourse community that is ethnographic research. So that's what you're doing for this class. You have a field guide, right? This is our textbook right here. It's the free textbook from Manifold, the Ethnography Made Easy. And in early in the quarter, I believe for this class, it's week 3. I assigned this reading, which is Conducting Interviews by Samuel Feinsery. And basically all it is it's an overview of what conducting an interview in an ethnographic context actually entails. So, you'll get what an interview is, what it's for, oftentimes in this context. You know, and I think most importantly, the different kinds of interviews, you know, open-ended questions, closed questions. These are things that you're going to want to read. You don't have to think about, what am I doing? What's the right answer? What's the, you know, how do I conduct my interview from here? Right now, you're reading. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to do so before you conduct your interview, or you're really not going to come across as very professional. Even when you're interviewing your mother, you want to come across as though you know what you're doing, because that is a gesture of respect. And it's also just kind of like unethical not to prepare yourself for an interview when you're asking someone to give you information that is oftentimes deeply personal and, you know, vulnerable. So make sure, you know, you read about the different kinds of interviews, the formal and the informal. I tend to myself have a very informal interview style. And that's oftentimes because I am doing interviews about education and justice. And therefore, you know, I'm asking people to draw upon oftentimes very traumatic experiences that require my intervention in the context of the interview to feel personable, right? People don't want to share about their trauma if they're talking to somebody who is not a kind, an empathetic person, right? That can feel very well, it can create a situation where the person just shuts down and doesn't share at all. And that has certainly happened, right? And can happen, especially at the beginning of your career as somebody who's conducting interviews. So, you know, the author is going to talk quite a bit here about formal and informal interview processes, and, you know, just whatever kind of makes sense for you is what you should sort of lean into. And then, you know, preparing for an interview, I want you to really pay attention to the fact that the first sentence here is the interview preparation process takes time, thought, and effort. An interview, and this is why each week on the modules, I remind you, have you set up your interview yet? Have you begun to think about your interview? I'm going to push the date back a little bit on the interview due date, but, you know, it's something that is part of the learning process for this course, and it is part of the process of constructing an ethnographic research project for this course. It doesn't mean that the interview has to be the end all be all of your project, although for some of you it may end up being such a wonderful experience that it does kind of form the center of your project, you know. But that remains to be seen until you've actually done the work, right? So you have this whole very, very long guide that talks to you about, you know, basically what the interview is, what it does, what it's for, and how you can best prepare yourself. And you can read through, you know, and skim read it. Don't feel like, you know, this is not an exact science, right? Interviewing is a personal affair. So you can read and you can get an idea, but, you know, this is not ethnography is not an exact science, which is one of the reasons I love it, because it involves interpersonal communication. And of course, that is an art of being human. Okay, so you have the conducting interviews guide, and you also have this one, which you can find at the beginning of the modules, the general information modules. This is the one that I sort of, I like it because it's a kind of a field guide. And so it, you know, it breaks things down a little more simply than the other one, right? The other one's kind of a long introduction to ethnographic interviewing. But this one's, you know, it's nice. It's got kind of the bullet points, right? Research context before you engage. Be prepared to own your impact when you make a mistake, right? In other words, sometimes as an interviewer, you can say something that feels like you've been insensitive. Watch for those responses and own it. You know, don't try to fake your way through an interview, because people can really feel that. So if you say something that's like inappropriate, just say, you know what, my bad. I'm so sorry. that came out of nowhere. And I'm just, you can always use the excuse of I'm doing this for the first time, or I'm a novice. And, you might even want to lead with that so that the person is aware, like, they've agreed to do the interview with you. And they want to feel like they're in good hands. And I think ownership of your newness is probably the best way to kind of ensure that person feels at ease, even though they're in the hands of a novice, right? So so this one is like the one where you can kind of just really, it's just a basic how-to guide, right? And so you have that, right? You can kind of look this over. So the thing of it is, I'm showing you all of these things and where to find them, because this is your kind of your how-to, right? So you've got your conducting interviews in your week 3 checklist. You've got your, you can find the field guide that I just showed you here in the general information, and along with your course textbook. And then, once you, when you go to the instructions, you've got your checklist for your instructions for setting things up. Okay. So the way that I want you to go about preparing is, 1, read the materials and jot down any questions that you have, including and especially the understanding that in ethnographic interviewing, and in fact, it's the law, right? So just to kind of stress this, you have to get a consent, and you have a consent form. Actually, I didn't make sure that you do have the consent form. Yeah, here's the consent form. So you can adapt your consent form. There's consent forms all over the internet. And you can, I've given you the consent form from UCI for archiving because that's what we do at UCI, but you can use your consent form. You can use it. You can even make a consent form yourself. Just make sure that you understand the language that you're using. So, and there's consent forms too, I believe, on the field guide as well, like sample consent forms, but you have to have a consent form or you cannot publish or reproduce the interview. So, for our class, it's not as big of a deal if you don't get one, but since this is public writing and we do a lot of things collaboratively and you will have access to each other's materials, technically you are publishing that person's words. And so you will need to get that consent form if you do decide to put this interview into your project. And like I said, the interview can end up being something that you feel like was a learning experience, but you've decided not to include it in your project, in your final project, just on your annotated bibliography as part of your research. Or it can be so, transformative that it becomes really the central aspect of your project and you sort of build your project around the interview. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So like I said, once again, read the materials, make sure that you understand that you're going to need a consent form from the person that agrees to be your interview subject. And then once you do that, you're going to want to take some notes about the interview. Like, what kind of interview will you do? What kind of interview, what do you hope the interview will achieve? So, you're going to have to give all of this stuff some thought, right? Like, who do I have in my life that might be a suitable interview candidate? Is there nobody? Am I going to have to track somebody down? Do I understand what makes a suitable interview candidate? So when I tell you to go to look at these ACRL frameworks and think about the role of granting authority, really that's just a kind of a guideline for thinking through what it is we think counts as a credible or authority on the subject. Now, for me, if, for example, you're writing on pandemic learning, and you're talking and you're doing an autoethnography, and you're writing about yourself and your own experiences, then you might decide to interview, say, your parents, one of your parents who might have had particularly unique kinds of challenges because of your learning at home. Some parents I know were trying to, teach their 5-year-olds and their 3-year-olds, and then they'd have 12 and 13 or 17-year-olds also doing online schooling. So that would be a suitable or credible or authoritative interview subject, and somebody who could offer you insight that maybe you yourself don't possess. You could also interview a friend. So I've had some students doing that same topic where they're talking about the pandemic, and they interview, a college roommate, and they are talking about their experiences with the pandemic and how those experiences were unique. And they actually kind of came to the conclusion that the experiences were unique because they had different kind of parental interventions in their lives. And so, you can find that interview here. This is linked under the course modules for week 3. This is all the stuff that you already did. So if you want to go back and find those unpublished interview samples, that would be in the week 3 module. And then you can go down and look at, there's 4 there right now. And computer's being a little lame. Here it is. Education deficit during COVID shutdown. This is an audio interview between, like I said, 2 people who were roommates in college talking about their different experiences. And that was a very casual interview. So that would be a informal kind of interview. But then you have other interviews here. Racial discrimination of Black women in medical school. That is a formal interview between a student who is a bio major trying to go to medical school, and she's interviewing a doctor who is a mother of a friend. And it's a formal interview talking about how this woman who has become a medical doctor faced discrimination in medical school. So for those of you who are doing anything related to medical racism, related to discrimination in education, this would be a really good interview to cite and to maybe imitate if you're thinking about going down that route. The other formal interview here would be the SOAR interview. That's an interview between a student, and this is an even more formal interview because this student just met this person when she did the interview, and this was the director of the student outreach and retention at UCI. So this is a student services person at a major university, and the student wanted to ask her about what it's like to try to provide services to underrepresented students, with a lot of challenges, with not the best, resources on hand for providing those services to students, and but also just like what the mission is, how it works, how the organization works, et cetera, et cetera. So this would be a formal interview. And then racial discrimination of Black girls in education is another informal interview, and this is probably the most informal. I would compare this one really to the one that you watched, the video from Lucid, which was, I think, here. This is actually, sorry, everybody. Let me see if I can. Oh, here we go. This would be the interview between Angel and Alejandro that I had everybody watch. And this is also a very, very informal interview. So, these are 2 best friends from school. They've known each other their entire lives. And this one is racial discrimination of Black girls in education is two sisters, and they're also talking about their experiences in school with racial discrimination against Black girls. So you have a lot of samples to look at, a lot of things to kind of think about what might work for you, for your topic. It really does depend on the topic. It really does depend on the goals. This is the interview with Shauna Goldhammer with my one of my students for my class, was an interview with a deaf and hard of hearing teacher between Shauna, the deaf and hard of hearing teacher, and my student who is herself deaf and hard of hearing. And so some of you are going to do projects where you're really getting into like the stuff that you faced as obstacles in your education journey. And that would be a sort of strong autoethnographic project where it's like, this is about me, but I'm using my experience to kind of raise awareness, to educate people, and to begin to, explore avenues for advocacy work, kind of changing the system, right? Making things better for the students who come after me. So in addition to reading all of the material about what ethnographic interviewing is, I want you to look at the samples again. If you haven't already done that, you have written about the samples. So really kind of trying to think about your impressions, what you wrote about, and how you might model or do something else, right, for your own interview. Let's see, what have I, yeah, okay. So the very last thing that I'll say about this is that once you've kind of done all of this pre-work, pre-reading, looking at samples, then I want you to set up a practice interview. So don't make your first interview that you've ever done with the person that you're interviewing. Practice with a friend, practice with your a parent or your sibling or somebody that you feel comfortable with, and get the jitters out. So you can create some practice questions. Here's some I've got practice questions here. Yeah. So sample warm-up questions, right? So, you can, if you want to set up a kind of a mock interview with somebody to help you figure out things like sound quality, video quality, right? These are all things that you might not catch when you're trying to set up a formal interview. But if you do it for the first time, you're like, oh, wow, I'm definitely going to need to fix the sound on this. And, for equipment for your sound, it's really easy to procure, like you can use kind of split mics if you have access to that. But if your phone's not working, if you're having sound quality problems, make sure you check it beforehand. And if you don't know what to do about it, you can contact me and I'll help you figure it out. Okay. But do try to, practice with interviews so you can listen for sound, so you can listen to your own voice. Sometimes it can be very alienating to hear yourself recorded and to hear yourself try to perform, the role of the interviewer. And that's why it's really, really important to just do kind of sample interviewing. So when you do the sample interview, have a little goal, right? Like our goal for this interview is to talk about our best memory of our childhood, and then maybe conclude, our research question is did people in who were 12 years old in 2018 have it better than people who are 12-year-old in 2023, right? Something silly like that. I mean, childhood's childhood, right? But have a little goal, do a little bit of practice, make it a kind of fun thing, and then use it to sort of help yourself figure out what things you would do differently when you conduct your formal interview. Most of the time, I would say the main things are sound quality. So, the hardware issues, but also the initial kind of making the person who you're recording comfortable. So some students will regret when they just kind of like get right in there with the interview and start asking questions without kind of contextualizing a little bit. So like, introducing the person or allowing the person to introduce themselves, introducing yourself, saying what the project is about, what the interview is for, thanking the person for being with you today. Thank you so much for this interview. I really appreciate you being here with me today to talk about this issue, that kind of getting things started. And then, as your first question, you might say, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to, let's say you're doing your topic on medical racism. What is your connection to the topic of that we're discussing today, which is medical racism? And then let that person, talk as much or as little as they want to. If you find yourself in a situation where your interviewee is, most of the time people they're prepared for the interview, they're eager to talk, and they have a lot to say. That's mostly what happens when you tell somebody what you're doing and you give them the information up front. But if they sense that you're kind of awkward and you don't know what to say, then sometimes their answers will be very short and kind of curt. And then your responsibility as the interviewer is to make them comfortable by giving them some what they call food for thought, right? So giving them something to kind of think about, rather than kind of coming at them with a question and being like, answer. You could say, in my experience with, let's say the topic is, myth of the model minority, right? So you might say, in my experience with this model minority stereotype. Now, if I'm doing that interview and I am not somebody who has any direct experience with the myth of the model minority, then I might say, right, I have no experience myself directly with discrimination of the myth of the model minority, but you could say something that you do relate, right? Something that does connect you to that, right? My only experience with being minoritized in that particular way is, right, the assumptions that come when someone sees me, and of course they oftentimes see a woman and they make assumptions about who I am or what I stand for because I am a woman, or I present as a woman, and I of course there are all kinds of inferences that people make about that. So you could sometimes try to establish some conversational connections with your interview subject, some things that kind of bridge your relationship so that there is that point of connection. And this is something that we do just as like human beings in conversation when we're trying to make another person feel comfortable, is to just open up and be open ourselves about things that make us vulnerable, right? So showing your interview subject that like, you're not afraid to go there either. At the same time, right, you don't want to make an interview all about you. So it is a fine line. It is an art. And of course, you want to stay focused on your goals, which is to create an atmosphere for your interview subject that enables them to share their experiences, to feel valued, to feel heard and seen and listened to feel that you're very interested in who they are. And for you to do that, you need to go into this interview prepared, right? Prepared with what you, with good, open-ended questions that help that person to kind of think, with a good attitude, that shows you're not trying to rush that person, that you're not trying to, stick with your agenda, that you have questions, but you're going to try to allow them to answer naturally. And most importantly, right, you're listening to what that person is saying so that you can kind of naturally follow up with other questions based on what they're saying, right? So it's like you have your list of questions in front of you, but remember, this isn't an interview for a job, right? It's not like these are the things you must answer, right? It's like, these are the things that you as the researcher are kind of trying to understand better, or the things that you've prepared. But sometimes interviews can go in a direction that you never could have dreamed of, and oftentimes that direction will be like the best thing you could have hoped for, right? And your questions then become pointless and your interview becomes everything, and then your research project begins to take on a different, sometimes, much more direct, it begins to take on a much more direct path, right? So the path kind of begins to unfold based on who you're interacting with. And that's really the beauty, I think, of ethnographic research in general, is just that, what's happening in front of you, who you're with, who you're talking to, what kind of events or changes are taking place in the world. That is your material, right? Most importantly, then the goals that you have kind of laid out as a researcher, or the research that's out there. And we can all, I think, at this point in our lives, begin to identify with that model of professionalization, one that can meet the rapidly changing environments that we find ourselves living in at all times, and can do that without feeling like you're stressed out or you're freaking out because there's this fixed model that you're trying to operate from, and the changes are making it hard for you to fulfill those expectations, right? Ethnographic research is actually right, it's like, well, tomorrow this thing might look very different, and it's really adaptable in that way. And so, after the pandemic, I think we can all kind of relate to the concept of having to pivot based on what's happening in front of us. And so the interview is important for this class, precisely because it is, I think, more than any of the other kind of ethnographic practices that you're doing in this class, namely observation, field work, collecting photographs, and writing about things in your archive, right, in your personal archives or in institutional archives, right, things that have been preserved by professionals. But I think the interview, more than anything, right, even if you're doing surveys or something like that, really does kind of help you to understand how the ethnographic model is about human beings interacting with each other, that interpersonal connection, the understanding of yourself in a world of other people who may be part of the same discourse community that you're in, and really kind of beginning to understand new perspectives and learn and develop and grow from those perspectives. So, getting excited about like people, other people, right, including yourself. And then using using that excitement or that interpersonal connection, that real-time interaction, to guide the development of your research project. And then I guess the final thing I would say, right, other than making sure you understand what ethnographic interview process is about, it having a goal, creating good questions, being prepared, thinking through a suitable interview subject. Some people ask me if they can do more than one interview. You certainly can do as many interviews as you want. But, remember that you only have time to do so much. Doing a practice interview, making sure that your thing's all set up, and then, making sure that you procure your consent form, making sure that the day of you're prepared. Don't have, sometimes interviews don't go well, and that's okay, right? You get an interview subject who's like maybe in a terrible mood, or you're in a terrible mood, you're just not on your game. And if that happens, chalk it up to experience. But I think do the best that you can to prepare, and don't make your interview subject do all the work, right? Like I said before, don't make it all about you, but also be prepared to be respectful, come with a good set of questions, be prepared to be an active listener don't be too strict on what you're doing. Make sure that you hit that record button, right? And I think lastly, make sure that your interview subject really understands what it is they're there for and what it is you're hoping to get from the interview, right? So that they understand why they are there and what they're doing there to help you develop this research project, and so that they see themselves as participants in the production of a project that they too can get behind and believe in. Okay, so that is it. I hope that that was helpful to you. Oh, and the other thing is, if you find one final thing, if you want to use a transcript service, they do cost money, but I find that you can get a transcript by using Zoom, right? They'll give you an automated transcript, but you can also use Rev or Otter. I think Otter does not let you buy things piecemeal. You have to get a subscription, so that can be like expensive if you're not if this isn't something that you're going to like do all the time. I use Rev, which is you can buy it piecemeal. So like this is the interview that I'm working on right now. I basically broke every rule that I just showed you that I just talked about with you in this interview. So this is an incredibly long interview. You can see right here, it's a 2-hour and 25-minute interview. And I'm interviewing he's a prison rights activist at UCI, and he is an activist for prison education. And I interviewed him and his wife, and the interview went on and on and on. So what's very, very helpful is if you have a transcript service, and the service will give you like the exact timestamps. You can edit within the service and all of that. But that's for like I said, that costs money. And for something like this, you can easily use the auto-generated captioning from YouTube or Zoom to use your interview transcript to include writing as part of the way in which you implement the interview into your project. I have another video on implementing the interview into your project, so I'm not going to get into that here, but I will be posting that that interview once you're ready to begin integrating your interview into your research project. But that said, you should keep in mind that the interview, you might use all of the interview, like what my student, the deaf and hard of hearing student who interviewed Shauna Goldhammer, she used the full interview for her project. You could do that, or you could end up just using like parts of your interview, written dialogue. And like I said, we'll talk about that more in the coming weeks. Okay. Have a good one.